The building was always loud during the day, but at night it felt like a different world. The lights were dim, the air was cooler, and the long halls echoed with every small sound. That was when the janitor worked. He preferred it that way. Fewer eyes, fewer questions. He arrived every evening just before midnight, wearing the same faded uniform that hung loosely on his thin frame. His shoes were worn at the soles, and his hands were rough from years of cleaning floors no one cared to look at. Most employees never knew his name. To them, he was just part of the background, like the trash bins and the mop buckets. He cleaned quietly. He never complained. He never asked for anything extra. He wiped desks where important papers had been left behind. He emptied bins filled with half-finished meals, empty cups, and scraps of food wrapped in napkins. Sometimes, when no one was around, he would pause and look at the food for a moment longer than necessary. Hunger has a way of slowing time. He was paid very little. After rent, transport, and a few basic needs, there was almost nothing left. Some nights he skipped meals so he could save a little money. Other nights he drank water and told himself sleep would quiet the ache in his stomach. He never stole. He never took what belonged to someone else. But when food was already thrown away, untouched and clean, he saw it as something different. One night, after hours of cleaning, he opened the break room trash bin. Inside was a box with 2 slices of pizza, still warm, barely touched. He looked around, then slowly sat down at the small table. He ate carefully, like someone afraid the moment might disappear if he rushed it. He didn't know that a small camera in the corner had been upgraded just days earlier. The next morning, while the building was busy and full of voices, security reviewed the footage. They replayed the clip several times. A man in a janitor uniform, sitting and eating from the trash. Some laughed. Others frowned. Someone sent the clip to management by afternoon. The decision had already been made. He was called into an office he had never entered before. The walls were clean and bright. A long table stood between him and 3 people who barely looked up when he walked in. One of them slid a printed photo across the table. It was a still image from the camera. They didn't ask why. They didn't ask how long it had been since his last meal. They told him he had embarrassed the company. They said his behavior was unacceptable. They spoke about hygiene, image, and rules. The words came fast and cold, like they had been practiced. He tried to speak once, then stopped. He realized they weren't listening. A paper was placed in front of him. He was told to sign it. His job was over, effective immediately. He quietly stood, nodded once, and left the office without arguing. He picked up his bag from the storage room. Inside were his gloves, a small towel, and a photo folded many times. As he walked out of the building, people stared. Some whispered. One person laughed softly. No one stopped him. Outside, the evening air felt heavy. He stood on the steps for a moment, holding his bag. He looked up at the building he had cleaned for years, the place that knew his footsteps but not his story. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old phone. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. He scrolled through his contacts, paused, then pressed one name. He waited as it rang. When the call was answered, he spoke calmly. "It's done," he said. "They let me go." There was silence on the other end, then a quiet reply. "Are you ready?" He looked back at the building one last time. "Yes," he said. And with that, he walked away. He walked along the quiet streets, the cool night air brushing against his face. The city lights were far, and the sound of traffic was a dull hum in the distance. He kept walking, slowly, as if he was not just moving through the city but moving through memories that weighed on him. Few people knew that before he became a janitor. He had lived a very different life. Once, he had a job that paid well. He wore suits, sat in meetings with important people, and managed tasks that demanded respect. People looked at him with recognition. They wanted his advice, his opinion, his guidance. But life has a way of turning fast. A betrayal from someone he trusted cost him everything. One bad decision, one unlucky day, and his career crumbled. Money disappeared. Friends disappeared. Doors closed that once had opened easily. He could have fought back. He could have pleaded. But he had learned that sometimes survival means stepping aside, staying quiet, and living in the shadows. That was when he became the janitor. It was not shame that drove him there. It was necessity. It was a way to keep food on the table and a roof over his head without attracting too much attention. He didn't care what people thought. He cared about survival, about keeping a small sense of dignity intact while living in a world that had stripped him of almost everything. The food from the trash was not a sign of weakness. It was a way to survive. He had no family nearby, no one to send money to, except for one small person who depended on him more than anyone could imagine. Every dollar he earned went to helping them. That's why he ate so little and saved what he could. Every bite of discarded food was a step toward helping that person. He remembered nights alone in his small, cold apartment, the walls bare except for an old photo he kept. That photo reminded him why he worked quietly, why he endured humiliation, why he stayed invisible. It reminded him that even if the world had turned its back, someone somewhere depended on him. When the company fired him, they did not know any of this. They didn't know that the janitor they dismissed for eating scraps had once managed projects that involved millions of dollars. They didn't know that the person they humiliated had contacts and knowledge that could change everything if used wisely. They thought he was nothing. They thought he had no power, but he did. For weeks after leaving the building, he stayed out of sight. He rented a small room in a cheap boarding house. He spent time reading old notes, going through files he had hidden for emergencies, and contacting people he trusted. His phone calls were quiet, careful. No one outside of a very small circle knew what he was planning. The company continued its daily routine, unaware that the man they had discarded was preparing quietly. Meetings were held, deals were made, and employees carried on as if the world was normal. But cracks were forming. Contracts were delayed. Inspectors found small mistakes. Investors grew uneasy. No one could explain why things were starting to fall apart. Meanwhile, he contacted a few old colleagues who owed him favors or respected his past work. They remembered him as a person of integrity, someone who could be trusted. They were surprised to hear from him after so many years, but they listened. They understood his situation, and quietly, without fanfare, they began to help him. He was building something, though no one knew it. Not even the employees of the company he had once cleaned. Every day he reminded himself why he did what he did. It was not about revenge in the way people think. He did not want to humiliate those who fired him. He wanted justice, yes, but he also wanted recognition for people like him, workers who were invisible. People whose lives were ignored until they were useful or until someone made a mistake. At night, when the city slept, he planned. He studied financial records he had obtained through his old connections. He watched patterns, learned weaknesses, and waited for the right moment. He was patient. He had no rush. Time was on his side. One afternoon, while walking through a small park, he received a message on his phone. It was simple. Everything is ready. Are you sure you want to do this? He looked at the sky, the sun high above. The leaves rustled in the wind. A small smile crossed his face. He answered yes. It is time. For years he had been invisible. People had ignored him, laughed at him, dismissed him. But now they were about to learn something very important. Power is not always obvious. Sometimes it hides in the quietest, most overlooked places. Sometimes it waits for the right moment to reveal itself as he walked back to his small room. He paused by a window and looked at the streets below. The city moved without noticing him. That was perfect. That was how it should be. No one should know until it was time. He pulled out a folder from his bag. Inside were files, contacts, legal documents, and old agreements no one had remembered. With these, he could quietly influence the building he had once cleaned. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with knowledge and careful action. People would feel the effects before they understood what was happening. He spent the evening preparing, organizing, and making one final call. A voice answered, calm and patient. "It's almost ready," he said. "Do you want me to wait for the signal?" The voice asked. "No," he replied. I will handle the first step myself. Once they see me, everything else will follow." He hung up and looked around the small room. It was modest, but it felt like command central. Every paper, every note, every piece of information was in place. He had waited for this moment for a long time. The humiliation, the hunger, the invisibility, all of it had led here. Night fell again, and the city lights began to glow. He went to the window, watching the building he had left behind. It looked the same, but in his mind, everything had changed. The people inside might think they were safe, thinking they had fired a powerless janitor. But soon they would learn that appearances can be deceiving. He turned from the window, feeling the weight of the next few days. Every step had to be precise. Every action had to be careful. He had learned the hard way that mistakes could cost everything. But he was ready. More than ready. He had planned, he had waited, and he had power they could not see. Soon, very soon, they would understand. And when that day came, they would remember the man they had thrown away. He sat at the small table, looking at the files spread in front of him. Each one represented a thread, a pathway to the moment when he would walk back into the building. Not as a janitor, not as someone invisible, but as someone who held the tools to change everything. The city was quiet outside, unaware of the storm that was coming. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself imagine the look on their faces when they realized who he had become. Not anger, not revenge, just power, calm and undeniable. Then he opened his eyes. It was time to move forward. He would return, and when he did, nothing would ever be the same. Weeks passed since he had left the building. The company carried on, as usual, unaware that their world was slowly beginning to wobble. At first it was small things. A missed shipment. A document misplaced. A contract delayed. People shrugged it off, blaming tired staff or bad luck. But the mistakes continued, and the whispers grew louder. The employees began to notice tension in the office. Meetings lasted longer than necessary, and arguments broke out over trivial matters. The leadership seemed on edge, pacing halls and speaking in hushed tones. Decisions that had once been clear now seemed uncertain. Every day the weight of unseen pressure pressed down on them, and no one knew why. He watched it all from the shadows. Not physically, of course. He stayed hidden, keeping careful notes on changes, analyzing patterns, and knowing which buttons to press. He was like a quiet observer, seeing things no one else could see. The company thought it was luck or bad timing. He knew better. His contacts, the few people he trusted from his past life, helped quietly. They nudged decisions here and there, using their influence to create subtle shifts that would make the company falter. No one realized these moves were connected. They only saw the chaos growing. The janitor, once invisible, was now shaping events from behind the scenes with precision. One day, the CEO noticed that a critical investor was considering pulling out. Panic spread through the top floor. The board called urgent meetings trying to figure out what was wrong. Financial records were reviewed and reviewed again. Everyone was confused. There was no clear reason for the sudden decline. Reports clashed. Errors appeared in numbers that had always been perfect before. Meanwhile, rumors of a mysterious new partner began to circulate. No one knew who it was. Some assumed it was a wealthy outsider with interest in the company. Others thought it might be a competitor trying to destabilize them. Yet no one suspected the truth that the janitor, the man they had dismissed and humiliated, was quietly steering these events. Using knowledge and strategy rather than force, employees began whispering about odd occurrences. Some important documents seemed to disappear and reappear in unexpected places. Emails sent without explanation caused confusion. Small decisions made in different departments began to contradict each other. Anxiety grew. People were frustrated, exhausted, and afraid of making mistakes that could be blamed on them. The CEO started receiving anonymous tips. They hinted at weaknesses within the company, exposed minor errors, and suggested new contracts that were too good to be true. Every suggestion was carefully calculated to create a sense of imbalance and uncertainty. Yet, no one could trace them back to anyone real. It was like the company was being pushed from the shadows. Employees who had once laughed at the janitor, who had noticed him barely at all, now wondered what had been overlooked. How could someone so quiet, so small, make such a difference? They couldn't understand it. The truth was hidden beneath layers of careful planning, and the janitor stayed invisible as he watched the effects ripple outward. One afternoon, a mid-level manager discovered that a project critical to the company's future had been delayed due to incorrect paperwork. When he tried to trace the problem, he found conflicting instructions from different parts of the leadership. Confusion spread, and tension reached new levels. The CEO was called into the boardroom repeatedly. Advisors whispered warnings. Some employees considered resigning, fearful that the company's future was unstable. Meanwhile, the janitor remained calm. He had no desire to punish anyone. He simply wanted the company to realize the consequences of their actions, the mistakes of ignoring those they deemed unimportant. He wanted them to understand that even the quietest person can hold the power to influence everything. Then came the day when an unexpected visitor arrived. No one knew who they were at first. They had authority, presence, and a calmness that demanded attention. The visitor began making subtle moves, offering guidance, restructuring contracts, and quietly asserting influence over decisions. The board began to notice changes, seeing progress in some areas, but chaos in others. The company's direction seemed uncertain, and the leadership could feel it. The visitor never revealed their identity. No one connected them to the janitor, yet every action they took had been carefully pre-planned by him. He had prepared every step to appear as though events were unfolding naturally. The chaos and correction worked together, like two sides of a single coin. Employees began speaking in hushed tones about the mysterious partner who was influencing the company from afar. Some feared they were being watched. Some were inspired, sensing a subtle force guiding them to make better decisions. None realized that the person behind it all had once been invisible, ignored, and discarded for a small act of hunger. At night, the janitor reviewed the progress from his small room. Charts, notes, and reports were spread across the table. Every shift, every reaction, every mistake had been accounted for. He smiled quietly, knowing that the plan was working. The people inside the building were feeling the effects, but they had no idea why. They would not see him until he wanted them to. He thought back to the day he had been fired, the humiliation still fresh in his mind. The people who had laughed and pointed now had a storm approaching them without knowing its source. The invisible janitor had become a force they could not ignore. And then he received another message on his phone. It was simple, direct, and carried the weight of opportunity. It is time to return. Are you ready for the next step? He looked at the building from a distance, the familiar structure that once seemed so imposing, so distant. He took a deep breath and smiled. Yes, he whispered. It is time. He began preparing to re-enter the building. Not as a janitor, not as someone invisible, but as someone who held the knowledge, the influence, and the power to change everything. The day was coming when the employees and the leadership would have to face the man they had dismissed, the man they had underestimated, the man who had quietly become unstoppable. In the days that followed, small tremors shook the company. More errors, more delays, and subtle shifts in decision-making left everyone unsettled. The visitor remained an enigma, and the janitor stayed hidden, guiding events with calm precision. Soon, everything would come to a head. The time for observation was ending. The time for action was approaching. And when it came, they would remember the janitor not for the scraps he once ate, but for the power he held without anyone ever noticing. The morning was quiet when he arrived. The city moved as usual, unaware that one man's life was about to change everything. He walked with purpose, his steps steady and confident. Gone was the tired uniform and worn shoes. In their place was a simple but sharp suit, pressed and clean, shoes polished to a shine. The janitor, who had been invisible for so long now, carried himself with authority and calm power. As he approached the building, he felt a mix of anticipation and satisfaction. It had been weeks of careful planning, preparation, and quiet guidance from behind the scenes. Every moment had led to this. No one knew he was coming. They would not expect it. And when they saw him, the truth of his presence would hit harder than anything they had imagined. He entered through the front doors, greeted by the usual buzz of employees moving through the lobby. Some looked up, puzzled by the sight of a stranger in a suit. Others didn't notice, caught up in their own conversations. He moved calmly toward the elevator, ignoring the murmurs and the few curious glances. His focus was on the top floors, the heart of the company that had dismissed him so carelessly. The elevator doors opened, and he walked down the hall, each step measured. The familiar offices felt different now. The air was tense, filled with unspoken questions and growing unease. He passed employees who paused in their tasks, their eyes widening slightly as they recognized him more, at least sensed something unusual. He smiled faintly to himself. The recognition would come soon enough. He reached the executive office and knocked softly. The assistant looked up, startled, and hesitated. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply. "I am here to see the CEO." There was a pause. The assistant frowned, uncertain. She picked up the phone to call upstairs. Moments later, she returned, her expression a mix of curiosity and caution. "The CEO will see you now." He walked in, closing the door quietly behind him. The room felt smaller, more intense than he remembered. The CEO sat behind the large desk, papers scattered, eyes tired from weeks of pressure and uncertainty. When he looked up and saw the man standing there, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Who are you?" the CEO asked, voice shaky. "I am someone you dismissed," the man replied calmly. "I am someone you underestimated." The CEO blinked, trying to process the words. Recognition began to form. The janitor. The man they had fired weeks ago for eating scraps. He had been sitting quietly, invisible, and now he stood in front of them, calm, collected, powerful. "I don't understand," the CEO esta. The man walked slowly around the office, observing the reactions of the staff who had begun to gather outside the doorway, whispering to each other. "You thought you were getting rid of me," he said. "You thought that one small mistake, one act of survival, made me powerless. You were wrong." He laid a folder on the desk. Inside were documents, reports, and contracts, meticulously organized. He had traced every misstep, every weak point, every mistake that had gone unnoticed. He had guided events with care, quietly creating consequences that were impossible to ignore. The building's staff had felt the effects, even if they did not know why. Now the truth was in front of them. "I have been patient," he continued. "I have watched, guided, and prepared. I did not come here for revenge. I came here to show you what happens when you dismiss people without understanding their value. I came here to give you a choice." CEO leaned back, swallowing hard. He felt the weight of the man's presence, the calm authority that radiated from someone who had been underestimated for too long. The room was silent, the only sound the quiet shuffle of papers and distant murmurs from the hallway. "What choice?" the CEO asked cautiously. "A choice to do what is right," the man said. "You can continue as you are, blind to the mistakes you have made, and face the consequences. Or you can change. You can treat your employees with respect, recognize their efforts, and make decisions that honor the people who keep this company alive. The choice is yours." The CEO's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the folder. He began to read, scanning the careful notes, the evidence of how the janitor had guided events, and the subtle mistakes that had appeared under his quiet influence. Each page revealed the meticulous planning, the calm strategy, and the undeniable skill of a man they had thought powerless. The staff outside the office began to notice the tension. Whispers turned into low conversations. Some recognized the man, the janitor, who had seemed so small, so invisible. Now they realized he held the tools to shape the entire company. Respect, fear, and awe mixed together in their eyes. The man walked slowly back to the center of the office, meeting the CEO's gaze. "I am not here to humiliate you. I am here to remind you that power can exist where you least expect it. Respect is earned, not assumed. Every person in your company matters, even the quiet ones, the invisible ones, the ones you dismiss without thought." He paused, letting the words sink in. The room was still. No one spoke. The CEO closed the folder, his hands resting on the desk. He understood the gravity of the moment. The man who had been fired for eating scraps had returned not with anger, but with a calm authority and undeniable influence. "I understand," the CEO finally said, voice low, but sincere. "I see what I have overlooked. I see the mistakes we made, and I will do better. I will listen, I will respect, and I will make sure no one here is dismissed or ignored unfairly." The man nodded, a small, satisfied smile crossing his face. "Good. That is the first step. The rest will follow. But know this, I expect change, not just words. Actions matter more than anything." The staff in the hallway watched silently as the conversation unfolded. They could feel the shift in the air, the change in power and understanding. The man who had once been invisible now commanded attention and respect without raising his voice, without demanding it. He had returned not for revenge, but to create balance, to remind everyone that even those who seem small can hold great power. As he left the office, quiet footsteps echoed through the hall. Employees turned to watch him pass, awe and curiosity mixing in their expressions. Some nodded slightly, acknowledging the lesson he had just delivered. Others whispered among themselves. Realizing that the company's future would be different from this day forward, he stepped out into the street, the cool air brushing against his face. The building behind him was the same, but everything inside had changed. People had learned that power is not always obvious. Influence does not always come from titles or appearances, and respect, once lost, can be regained by those who act with wisdom and calm strength. He walked away, not angry, not triumphant in a selfish sense, but content. He had returned, shown his power, and reminded the world that those who are overlooked often hold the keys to change. The city moved around him, unaware of the quiet storm that had passed through one building. And the people inside who would never forget the janitor who returned with a power nobody expected. After his return, the company could no longer operate as before. The employees felt the change immediately. Meetings became more organized, decisions more deliberate, and a new sense of respect entered the air. The once tense and chaotic environment began to settle, slowly but surely. People started noticing that their voices mattered, that their actions had consequences, and that even the smallest contributions were important. The CEO, once blind to the struggles of his staff, began to make genuine efforts to understand the daily challenges faced by his employees. He called for meetings with people he had never spoken to before, listened to their experiences, and started implementing changes that prioritized fairness and recognition. Policies were rewritten, and teams were encouraged to communicate openly and honestly. It was not instant, but the direction was clear. Employees who had once overlooked or ridiculed the janitor began to realize their mistakes. Some approached him quietly, apologizing for their past behavior, seeking advice, or simply acknowledging the impact he had on their lives. He listened without judgment, responding with calm words and subtle guidance. He did not boast about his power or humiliate anyone. Instead, he used the opportunity to teach a lesson in humility, patience, and respect. The janitor's influence extended beyond the walls of the building. Contractors, clients, and investors noticed a difference in the company's operations. Mistakes that had caused delays were corrected, and communication became smoother. Confidence returned to the boardroom and beyond. People outside the company could sense that something had shifted internally. Though they could not pinpoint the exact reason, inside the company, the janitor continued to monitor quietly. He guided, advised, and occasionally corrected without making his presence obvious. His approach was subtle, a quiet power that shaped events with precision. Employees began to look up to him, not just for his intelligence or strategy, but for the calm authority he carried. He became a symbol of how respect and careful action could create meaningful change. He also ensured that workers who had once been ignored or undervalued received recognition. Raises, promotions, and opportunities were extended to those who deserved them, not just those who demanded attention. It was a quiet revolution, one that improved morale, productivity, and the overall culture of the company. People started taking pride in their work, knowing that their efforts would be noticed and appreciated. Outside the company, the city continued to move at its usual pace. Few people knew the story of the janitor who had been dismissed for eating scraps and had returned with a power nobody expected. Those who did hear the story often marveled at it, sharing it quietly with friends or colleagues. It became a tale of resilience, intelligence, and quiet strength, inspiring others to value the unseen contributions of those around them. The janitor himself remained humble. He did not seek fame or recognition. He continued to live simply, caring for the small person who depended on him, sending money, and ensuring their well-being. He had proven that even someone overlooked by society could create meaningful change when guided by patience, knowledge, and integrity. In time, the company stabilized completely. Mistakes became rare, communication improved, and the leadership learned to value every employee. The culture shifted from one of negligence and hierarchy to one of respect, fairness, and collaboration. Employees worked with renewed purpose. Inspired by the example of someone who had shown them the importance of recognizing the potential in everyone, the janitor's lesson extended beyond the workplace. People who had witnessed his journey began to reflect on their own lives. They thought about the moments when they had dismissed others unfairly or underestimated someone based on appearances. Slowly, a broader understanding of respect, humility, and patience spread through the community. One afternoon, the janitor walked past the building he had once cleaned. He paused for a moment, looking at the familiar walls and windows. Inside, people worked with a sense of purpose and pride that had been absent before. The building itself seemed different, not because it had changed physically, but because the people inside had learned to see and value one another. He smiled softly and continued on his way. He knew that his work here was done. The company had learned its lesson. The employees had learned theirs. And he had fulfilled his own purpose, not through anger or vengeance, but through calm action and quiet guidance. The story of the janitor, who returned with unexpected power, became a legend within the company. New employees heard it as a tale of humility, patience, and respect. The message was clear: never underestimate anyone, and recognize the value of every person, no matter how small or quiet they may seem. And for the janitor, life continued simply but meaningfully. He continued to support those who depended on him, lived with dignity, and carried the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the world underestimate him and had quietly proven that true power often comes from patience, knowledge, and integrity. In the end, the company thrived, the employees grew, and the lesson of respect and recognition endured. The janitor had returned with a power nobody expected, but it was not the power of money or force. It was the power of patience, understanding, and the quiet influence that comes from knowing one's worth and using it wisely. And that was a power that would last long after he had walked away. Months passed since the janitor had returned to the building, and life had settled into a new rhythm. The company no longer operated with fear or disorganization. The employees felt a renewed sense of pride and purpose. What had once been a place of tension and neglect was now a space where work was respected, ideas were heard, and small contributions mattered just as much as big ones. The janitor himself remained largely unseen. He did not linger inside the building, nor did he demand recognition. His work had been done, and he understood that true influence is often quiet and indirect. Instead, he spent his days focusing on the people who depended on him, ensuring they were safe, fed, and supported. He had proven something to the world, but more importantly, he had proven something to himself: that resilience, intelligence, and calm determination could change circumstances far beyond what anyone expected. Outside the company, the story of the janitor who returned with unexpected power began to spread quietly. Employees shared it with new staff members, friends spoke of it in small circles, and even competitors heard whispers of the tale. It became a lesson, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that the most overlooked individuals often carry hidden strength. The legend was not about revenge, wealth, or fame. It was about dignity, patience, and the quiet assertion of one's worth. Inside the building, life continued to improve. The CEO, once blind to the struggles of ordinary employees, had embraced a new style of leadership. He consulted with staff, listened without judgment, and made decisions that prioritized fairness and collaboration. Mistakes were corrected, communication became clear, and trust returned to the workplace. Employees who had once felt invisible found that their efforts were acknowledged and rewarded. The culture shifted from fear to respect, from neglect to attention, and from chaos to balance. The janitor, though absent from the daily hustle, remained a silent presence in their minds. Employees remembered the calm authority, the quiet power, and the lesson that someone who seemed small could hold extraordinary influence. He had shown them that intelligence, patience, and integrity could outweigh titles and appearances. Workers began applying this lesson in their own interactions, treating each other with greater respect, and recognizing that everyone had value. He occasionally received messages from people inside the company. They asked for advice on difficult situations, guidance on complex decisions, or simply sought reassurance that their contributions mattered. He responded with calm, thoughtful words, never asserting dominance or claiming glory. His guidance was subtle, shaping events in ways that encouraged growth, learning, and fair outcomes. The employees learned to trust the unseen influence that had quietly changed the company for the better. Outside the corporate walls, the janitor maintained his simple life. He continued supporting those who depended on him, carefully managing resources, and living modestly. Despite the power he wielded in the company, he did not let it change who he was. Humility remained his guiding principle. He understood that influence was not about control or dominance, it was about making a difference quietly, wisely, and with integrity. Occasionally, he walked past the building he had once cleaned, reflecting on the transformation that had taken place inside. The walls looked the same, but the energy within was different. People carried themselves with confidence, respect, and collaboration. Mistakes were fewer, communication was better, and the workplace had become a place of learning and growth. He smiled, knowing he had made a lasting impact without ever needing recognition. The employees continued to share his story, not as gossip or legend, but as a moral lesson. They spoke of humility, patience, and the importance of recognizing every person's value. They remembered the janitor not for the scraps he had eaten, nor for the humiliation he endured, but for the quiet power he revealed through calm intelligence, careful planning, and unwavering integrity. The story inspired a culture of respect and collaboration that extended beyond the building itself, influencing those who heard it in small, meaningful ways. Over time, even the most skeptical employees began to acknowledge the transformation. Work became more efficient, morale improved, and mistakes that once caused tension were handled with understanding and problem-solving. People realized that the janitor's lesson was not about fear or dominance, but about guiding others to recognize their own value and the value of those around them. The power he had displayed was subtle, but undeniably reshaped the company from the inside out. He remained a quiet observer, stepping in only when necessary, always guiding with calm wisdom. His presence was a reminder that influence is not always loud or visible. Sometimes the most powerful impact comes from someone who watches, listens, and intervenes only when it is truly needed. The employees carried his lesson forward, applying it in their own work and interactions, creating a ripple effect of respect, humility, and understanding. The company thrived, not because of new investments or rapid expansion, but because its people had learned a valuable lesson: respect. Integrity and quiet leadership matter more than titles, appearances, or status. Mistakes became opportunities for learning, collaboration became natural, and employees began to trust both each other and the leadership. For the janitor, life continued in its simple, meaningful way. He maintained his focus on the small, personal responsibilities that mattered most, living modestly but with purpose. The story of his return and the transformation he inspired remained alive in the hearts and minds of those who had experienced it directly. And the ripple effects of his actions continued to influence the company for years to come. In the end, his power was not measured in wealth, control, or fear. It was measured in the respect he earned, the dignity he restored, and the culture of understanding and collaboration he nurtured. The janitor, who had once been invisible, had changed the lives of many, proving that true strength often lies in patience, humility, the quiet assertion of one's worth. And so the story endured. Employees remembered, lessons were applied, and the company flourished. The janitor had returned with a power nobody expected. But the power that truly mattered, the power to inspire respect, change culture, and influence lives, remained lasting and unforgettable.